Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be looking at component state and event handlers. Till now, all our applications have been such that their appearance remains the same after the initial rendering. So what if we wanted to create a counter, for example, where the value is increased as a function of time or at a click of a button? So first, we're going to create our application without using state. And as we will see, this method will not be so effective. So we're going to go ahead and create our folder, and we're going to call it state and event handlers. Then we're going to open our terminal and we're going to navigate to this folder. And we're going to run our command. Now, if you do not understand this and other commands, I've explained them all in my first video. So you can go to that and come back to this video. So we're going to call our project state and we're going to use the React template. Once that's done, we're going to cd into our project and we're going to run npm install, which is going to install our dependencies. Once that's done, we're going to go to our code, which is located in the source folder. Again, we're going to delete the files we don't need. And inside the app and the main file, we're going to clear everything out. So in our app file, we're going to create our app component. And we're going to pass in an input, so we're going to use props. And we're going to return a div. Which simply displays props.counter. Now, using the knowledge we gained from the previous video about JavaScript concepts, we can simplify this code using destructuring. So let's say here we could have a variable called counter and we could set it equal to props.counter and we can use this variable. Now we can further simplify this using destructuring. So instead of using a variable, we're going to directly pass in our counter variable as input. So what this is going to do is it's going to take whatever object we give it and it's going to assign it to the counter variable. So once we've done that, we're going to export our component. And in our main file, we're going to import the component. We're also going to import React DOM. And we're going to render our component to the browser. And we're going to run the render function. And we're going to pass it our app component. Now, this is what we would usually do, but in this case, our app component actually takes in an input. So we're going to pass in a counter. So let's just create a variable called counter and we're going to set it equal to 1. And we're going to pass it in to our component. Now, if we ran this, we would simply just get 1. But instead, we want to increase our counter each time and we want to re-render our screen. And in order to do that, we're going to move the render statement inside a function. So let's just call it refresh. It's not going to take any input. And we're going to put in our render statement inside this function. So now what we want to do is call the refresh function. And we're going to increase our counter variable by 1. And we're going to call refresh again. Then we're going to increase counter by 1 and let's do it one more time. Let's call refresh and let's increase counter by 1. So now we can save our file and open the terminal. We're going to navigate to our project, which is in state, and we're going to cd into state. And in here, we're going to run npm run dev. And now if we go to our browser, and if we refresh the page, we simply get 3. And as always, we should always have our developer console open. So we're not seeing 1, 2, and 3, we're simply seeing 3. That is because the re-rendering is happening very fast. So we need to add a delay so we could see the numbers increasing. So we're going to go back to our code. And in here, we're going to use a function called setInterval. So what the setInterval function does is it's going to add a delay to whatever code we pass into it. So we're going to remove this and we're going to call the setInterval function. So what this does is it's going to take a function as its first input. And inside the function, we're going to have whatever code we want to run, which in this case is going to be refresh. And we also want to increase our counter. And the second input it takes is the interval in which we want to run this code. So in our case, we want to run it, let's say, every 3 seconds. So in that case, we're going to have 3000 since the setInterval function takes input in milliseconds. So this is going to be the same as a 3-second interval. Now we can save our file and go to the browser. As you can see, we get 1, then we get 2, then we get 3. Now you may have noticed that in the console we're getting an error. That is because we're making repeated calls to the render method, and this is not the recommended way to re-render components. Now we're going to see the better way of accomplishing the same effect using component state. So we're going to put back our main file to how it usually is. So we're going to delete this and we're going to also remove our function. We also don't need the counter variable anymore. So we're going to remove that as well. And inside parentheses, we're going to remove the counter attribute. And now we're going to save our file. Now we're going to go to the app file. Now to use state in our application, we need to import it. So the way we do that is using import, and in curly braces, we're going to have use state. Then we're going to import it from React. The reason we use curly braces is because we want to specifically import the useState function so we can use it directly in our code. Now to use it, first we're going to remove the input from our app component since we don't need it anymore. And in here we're going to define a variable called, let's call it counter and set counter. Now these are the two variables we're going to be using. Now you've seen this syntax before when we were dealing with destructuring arrays. So we're going to see that again here. And we're going to set it equal to useState. And in parentheses, we're going to pass in an initial value we want counters to be. So let's just pass in 0. So the useState function is going to return an array with 2 items, which we are going to be destructuring to the counter and to the set counter variable. And initially counter is going to be 0 because we passed in 0 to the useState function. Now we're going to use another built-in function called set timeout. And this function also takes in a function as an input. So in the set timeout function, we're going to run the following piece of code. So in order to change the state of our counter variable, we're going to be using the set counter. So we're going to call set counter. And we're going to pass it whatever counter currently is plus 1. So what this is going to do is it's going to increase counter by 1 each time this statement is called. Now we're going to have a timeout of, let's say, 3 seconds. Now you might have noticed that here we did not use the setInterval function, we used the set timeout function. That is because we do not need to have an interval here. Each time the set counter function is called, our page is going to re-render, so we do not need an interval, we just need a timeout. So after 3 seconds, the set counter function is going to be called, and that is going to trigger a re-rendering of our component. And again, set counter is going to be recalled with a new value, and that is how the counter is going to be increased. So we do not need an interval. So now we can simply return a div that displays our counter, and we can save our file and go to the browser. And now we get 0, then we get 1, then we get 2. So we're getting it in 3-second intervals. And if you look at the console, the error has disappeared because we're using the right method to re-render our component. So this is how you use state in your application. Now let's look at event handlers. Event handlers are used to detect when a specific event happens in your application. For example, now we're going to be seeing a mouse click event. So we're going to refactor our code so that instead of a timeout, we're going to increase our counter by the click of a button. So we're going to remove the set timeout and we're going to return multiple statements. So we need a wrap. And in here, first we're going to simply display our counter as we did before. So we're going to say counter and we're going to pass in the counter variable. And now we're going to have a button that is used to increase our counter. So we're going to have a button tag. Now to get this event of clicking the button, we need to use the onClick attribute of our button. So what this is going to do is whenever the button is clicked, it's going to run a function, which we're going to pass in here. So we're going to pass in a function called increase counter, which we haven't defined yet, but we're going to define it now. So we're going to define this function. We're going to have const increase counter, which takes in no input. And it's simply going to use the set counter function to increase our counter by 1. We also need to add in some text to the button. Let's just add a plus symbol. Now we can save our file and go to the browser. As you can see, we have our counter, and when we press on our button, our counter increases. We can also have multiple buttons. So let's add buttons to decrease our counter and to set our counter to 0. So we're going to copy this button and we're going to paste it 2 more times. And we're going to pass in a different function each time. For the second one, we're going to pass in a function called 0 counter, which we're going to be defining. And finally, we're going to have a decrease counter function. And we're going to also replace the text with a minus. And for the 0 counter, we're going to have the text 0. So now let's define our functions. So the first function we're going to define is the decrease counter function, which takes no input, and it's simply going to use the set counter function to pass in counter minus 1. So it's going to decrease our counter variable. We also need to define the 0 counter function, which also takes no input, and it's going to use set counter and it's going to pass in 0. So it's going to set our counter to 0. So now we can save our file and go to the browser. As you can see, we have 3 buttons. So if we press on the 0 button, it resets our counter. The plus button increases our counter, and the minus button decreases our counter. So this has been an introduction to event handlers and component state. Thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to show your support.